like the four groups you just mentioned, we're all really doing tremendously well at the moment, like you say.
Wolverhampton's got a #1 album too.
Yeah, it really is, yeah.
And he really enjoys having it said to him, Bruce, yeah, that Bruce.
Jeff Lynne's entire career can be traced back to a single moment of inspiration. When he heard the Beatles, something clicked in his mind. He understood what he wanted to do with his life. His mission became clear. Take the energy and excitement of rock and roll music, combine it with the grandeur of orchestral arrangements, and craft something truly perfect. Not just good or even excellent, but genuinely perfect in every way. This pursuit of perfection defined everything Lynne did throughout his musical career. He believed every single note needed to be exactly right. Every harmony had to be stacked with precision. Every sound required polishing until it shined brilliantly. Some people thought he was being obsessive or taking things too far, but Lynne saw it differently. To him, this wasn't obsession at all. It was simply caring deeply about the music he created. While many other musicians and producers were willing to settle for something that was good enough, Lynne refused to stop until he reached something ideal. Lynne once shared a story about creating one of his most famous songs. He explained that he wrote the track while staying in Switzerland. The weather had been cloudy and gray the entire time he was there. For about a week straight, he never saw the sun break through the clouds. This experience directly inspired the song, showing how real-life experiences shaped his creative output. His approach to recording was meticulous beyond what most people could imagine. He would spend entire weeks working on getting just one guitar tone exactly right. He'd dedicate months to layering vocal tracks on top of each other. He'd invest years building complete albums that would stand the test of time. Every detail mattered to him. Lynne grew up in Birmingham, which gave him his start in the music industry. His early training with various bands taught him the fundamentals of his craft. But it was when he formed the Electric Light Orchestra that he finally found true creative freedom. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. Now he could finally do what he'd been dreaming about for years. He could put cellos into rock songs. He could build symphonies using pop music hooks as his foundation. He could create soundscapes so rich and lush that listening to them felt like falling into soft clouds. Music critics often said his approach was too much. They argued he was overdoing the orchestration and production. But fans completely disagreed with these critics. They heard something different in Lynne's work. They heard someone who was taking music seriously, treating simple 3-minute songs like they were grand cathedrals worthy of devotion and careful construction. As Lynne's reputation grew, he became one of the most sought-after producers in the music industry. Legendary artists wanted to work with him. George Harrison, Tom Petty, Roy Orbison, and later the Traveling Wilburys all collaborated with Lynne. Each of these collaborations showed his distinctive fingerprints. His productions had a particular clarity. They had warmth. They had that signature polished sheen that people came to recognize as his trademark sound. Behind all Lynne's success were 7 specific albums that he studied intensely. He treated these records like sacred scripture. They showed him what music production could truly achieve. They taught him how far you could push the idea of perfection before your work became cold and sterile. They revealed where the line existed between polish and soul. These 7 albums shaped not just Lynne's approach, but influenced modern production techniques that countless other producers would later use. Del Shannon's groundbreaking debut. Jeff Lynne discovered Del Shannon's debut album from 1961 and immediately recognized he was hearing something that pointed toward the future of music. The album featured a song called Runaway that contained something truly unprecedented for its time. There was an instrument called a Musitron organ, creating sounds that nobody had ever used in pop music before. That strange, spacey solo was unlike anything on the radio. Shannon's voice cracked with genuine emotion throughout the recording. The overall production was raw, but showed real inventiveness. Max Crook played that musitron and created textures that seemed almost otherworldly. Lynne heard someone who was taking creative risks, using technology in innovative ways, and making pop music that was both strange and wonderful at the same time. This was exactly what Lynne wanted to do with his own music. Shannon wrote hit songs, but never talked down to his audiences. Runaway told authentic stories about real heartbreak that people could relate to. The musical arrangements served the emotion without drowning it out. This balance fascinated young Lynne. He wondered how you could make something slick and professional without losing the honesty that made it connect with people. Shannon had found the answer. He created professional production that still maintained authentic feeling. Later in his career, Lynne would chase this exact same balance. The Electric Light Orchestra's orchestrations were incredibly elaborate and complex, but underneath all those layers lived real songs about genuine emotions that people experienced. What really stuck with Lynne was Shannon's fearlessness when it came to using new sounds. That musitron organ shouldn't have worked in a pop song, but it worked perfectly and became an iconic part of the recording. This taught Lynne an important lesson. Unusual choices could become signature sounds that defined your work. Later, he would use a vocoder on his famous song about blue skies. He blended synthesizers with string sections on countless Electric Light Orchestra tracks. He was taking chances the way Shannon had, making weird sounds beautiful and making technology feel emotional rather than cold. Shannon proved that pop music could be adventurous. Radio hits didn't require generic, safe production. Innovation actually attracted audiences rather than pushing them away. This was a lesson Lynne carried throughout his entire career. Roy Orbison's emotional power. Roy Orbison's album from 1962 destroyed Jeff Lynne emotionally. That voice could reach places that other singers simply couldn't access. Orbison sang with an operatic range, but maintained a rock and roll heart. His songs built from quiet whispers to powerful wails. The production by Fred Foster was sparse, but extremely effective. String sections would sweep in at exactly the perfect moments. Backing vocals supported the lead without competing against it. Everything was carefully designed to showcase that impossible voice. Lynne studied this approach carefully. He learned how restraint in production could actually amplify the impact rather than diminish it. Orbison's melodies were complex and didn't follow standard verse-chorus structures. His songs wandered through different sections, building toward climactic moments, then pulling back again. One song would crescendo continuously until the final note. It had no traditional chorus, just escalating drama throughout. This compositional approach influenced Lynne's own songwriting style significantly. Electric Light Orchestra songs often featured multiple distinct sections, unexpected key changes, and dramatic builds. Lynne was learning from Orbison's fearless approach to song construction. What moved Lynne most deeply was the raw emotion. Orbison sang like his heart was genuinely breaking. There was no irony, no emotional distance, just pure vulnerability wrapped in perfect technical execution. That combination was extremely rare in popular music.
Later in his career, Lynne would get the chance to produce Orbison for the Traveling Wilburys project. Getting to work with his hero was a dream come true. The experience confirmed what the records had taught him years earlier. Orbison never faked anything in his performances. Every single note was genuine and real. Roy Orbison showed Jeff Lynne that technical excellence and emotional honesty weren't enemies of each other. Perfect pitch could carry perfect pain. Craftsmanship served the feeling rather than replacing it. Brian Wilson's Production Bible. Brian Wilson's masterpiece from 1966 gave Jeff Lynne his production Bible. This album was everything Lynne wanted music to be. It featured sophisticated arrangements meeting perfect pop melodies. Wilson used bizarre instruments throughout the recording. He used bicycle bells, dog barks, and even soda cans filled with different levels of liquid for percussion sounds. But nothing felt like a gimmick. Everything served the emotional core of the songs. One particular song was possibly the most beautiful song ever recorded, Another track ached with yearning. Wilson proved that complexity could still be accessible to regular listeners. The vocal harmonies were mathematical perfection, layered until they became instruments themselves. Lynne dissected these arrangements obsessively. He studied how Wilson stacked voices and which musical intervals created which emotions. Later, Electric Light Orchestra's vocal layers would reflect this same obsession. Lynne's most famous songs featured dozens of vocal tracks. It was all Lynne's voice multiplied and layered into an entire choir. Wilson had shown him this was possible and could sound glorious. Wilson's studio techniques completely revolutionized Lynne's thinking about production. Wilson recorded instruments at different speeds. He built tracks layer by layer. He used the mixing board as a compositional tool, rather than just a way to balance volumes. The studio recording wasn't just for capturing performances anymore. It was a place for creating sounds that would be impossible to reproduce in a live setting. This philosophy became the foundation of Lynne's entire approach. Electric Light Orchestra records were studio creations, perfected pieces of audio architecture. This album taught Jeff Lynne that ambition was absolutely necessary. Pop music deserved obsessive attention to detail. Spending months working on one album wasn't wasteful. It was an act of worship toward the music itself. The Shadows' instrumental mastery. Before the Beatles completely consumed his attention, Lynne worshipped the band called The Shadows. Their album from 1961 showcased instrumental rock music at its absolute finest. The guitarist's tone was revolutionary for its time. It was clean, bright, and drenched in echo effects. Their hit songs were melodies you couldn't possibly forget. No vocals were needed at all. The guitar sang everything that was necessary. Lynne studied the guitarist's technique carefully. He learned how someone could make 6 strings tell complete stories. He learned that tone was just as important as the actual notes being played. The band's arrangements were meticulous. Every instrument had a precise role to play. The rhythm guitar provided the solid foundation. The bass walked melodic lines. The drums pushed the song forward without overwhelming everything else. The production was remarkably crisp. Everything was clearly audible. There was no muddy sound, no confusion, just absolute clarity. Lynne absorbed this lesson and carried it forward. Later, even Electric Light Orchestra's densest productions maintained this same clarity. 30 instruments might be playing simultaneously, but each one occupied its own frequency range and its own space in the mix. What Lynne loved most was the band's professionalism. They rehearsed until everything was perfect. They recorded efficiently. They made difficult things seem effortless. This work ethic became Lynne's personal standard. He'd spend days getting one guitar part exactly right. He spent weeks perfecting drum sounds, not because he enjoyed tedious work, but because he respected the music enough to get it absolutely right. The Shadows proved that British musicians could innovate and create rather than just imitate American rock music. They showed that Birmingham could produce world-class sounds. Lynne carried this belief with him throughout his entire career. The Beatles' evolution. Jeff Lynne called one particular Beatles album from 1965 the moment everything changed in popular music. This recording called the Beatles in the middle of evolving as artists. They were still making pop music and still accessible to mainstream audiences, but everything was deeper now. They introduced new instruments to rock music. They achieved lyrical maturity that was unheard of in pop songs. They questioned existence itself through their music. The album worked as a unified statement rather than just being a collection of singles with filler tracks. Lynne recognized this as a template for his own work. Albums could be art objects and complete experiences rather than just vehicles for hit singles. The production was becoming more adventurous. They used double tracking on vocals and unusual microphone placements. The studio was becoming a creative partner in the process. Lynne studied every single choice they made. He analyzed how they got particular guitar sounds and how the harmonies locked together flawlessly. The album was recorded quickly but sounded carefully considered. That paradox intrigued him deeply. Spontaneity and craftsmanship could coexist in the same work. The songwriting evolution fascinated Lynne most of all. The band was pushing beyond simple love songs. They were writing about loneliness, doubt, and introspection, but they kept the melodies absolutely irresistible. This balance became Lynne's personal goal. Electric Light Orchestra songs could be about alienation or time travel, but they absolutely had to have hooks that listeners would hum for days afterwards. Substance and catchiness weren't opposites. This album proved it conclusively. It showed Lynne that the Beatles were more than just a rock band. They were composers, innovators, and artists who refused to repeat themselves. Every subsequent Beatles album pushed boundaries even further. Lynne watched that evolution religiously, took careful notes, and applied the lessons to his own work.
The Beatles' sonic peak. Jeff Lynne considered a later Beatles album from 1969 to be their sonic peak. This was the band and their producer at maximum creative powers. The production was absolutely immaculate. Every instrument was recorded beautifully. The guitar tones were thick and mysterious. The bass lines were melodic perfection. The drums throughout were crisp without being harsh. This was exactly how records should sound. This was the standard everyone should aim for. One side of the album featured a medley that gave Lynne his roadmap for creating ambitious works. Multiple songs flowed seamlessly together. Different styles and different moods were all connected into one continuous journey. This showed that albums could have narrative flow and could be experienced as journeys rather than just heard as collections of songs. Later, one of Electric Light Orchestra's most ambitious albums would use this exact concept. Long suites of interconnected pieces created musical storytelling. The orchestration on the Beatles album was sophisticated, yet always served the songs. String sections created cinematic atmosphere without ever overwhelming the melodies. Lynne studied these arrangements note by note. He learned how strings could add drama and how brass could add power. He learned how to blend acoustic and electric instruments seamlessly. This album was the Beatles' farewell. They made it count. Every track was essential. Nothing was wasted. Lynne learned that final statements should be definitive. They should represent everything you've learned as an artist and show your full capabilities one last time. The ultimate blueprint. Jeff Lynne's #1 influence was inevitable. The famous concept album from 1967 was the record that made him decide to form the Electric Light Orchestra. The Beatles had accomplished exactly what Lynne dreamed about doing. They had merged rock music with classical music. They used orchestras as equal partners to guitars. They made concept albums commercially successful. They proved that pop music could be progressive without being pretentious. This was the blueprint Lynne needed. This was permission to pursue his vision. Every innovation on the album fascinated him. They used backwards guitar effects. They built orchestra sections that ascended into chaos. They used harps, accordions, sitars, and circus organs. Nothing was considered off limits. If something served the song, it belonged in the arrangement. This fearlessness became Lynne's own approach to production. Later, he would use vocoders, synthesizers, and orchestras all in the same track, following this album's example. If the Beatles could push boundaries, so could he. The production took months and hundreds of studio hours. The band and their producer built it layer by layer. This showed Lynne that truly great albums require time, patience, and perfectionism. You couldn't rush genius. Later, Lynne would take similar amounts of time building Electric Light Orchestra albums slowly and getting every single detail exactly right. This famous Beatles album validated his entire approach. It proved that rock music could be art. It could be taken seriously by critics. It could push creative boundaries while remaining accessible to mainstream audiences. This album was Jeff Lynne's North Star, guiding his entire career. Everything about the Electric Light Orchestra started here, in these grooves, in this vision, in this perfect record.
Jeff Lynne never stopped chasing perfection throughout his entire life. These 7 albums taught him craft, courage, and vision. His productions gleamed and shined because these masters showed him that polish didn't mean soulless. They proved that perfection and emotion could coexist in the same work of art.